What's the reason for the arrest of democracy leaders in Hong Kong? 15 activists face court as more concerns are raised about the city's autonomy. Could this trigger more turmoil? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. The coronavirus pandemic has interrupted the anti-government protests that gripped Hong Kong for much of last year. But the tension that triggered the unrest hasn't gone away, nor have the fears that Beijing is eroding freedoms that were guaranteed in the 1997 handover from British rule. In the latest crackdown, police arrested 15 leading activists and accused them of organising unlawful protests last year. They include politicians, a media tycoon, and Martin Lee, known as Hong Kong's father of democracy. Their supporters say the arrests are China's latest attempt to silence the pro-democracy protest movement. Al Jazeera's Divya Gopalan reports from Hong Kong.
There has been much international interest in what is happening here in Hong Kong. Both the UK and the US government have questioned the validity of these arrests, particularly mentioning Martin Lee. Now, he is very well known both in the international community and, of course, here in Hong Kong, and very well respected, not just amongst the democracy camp, but also among people who support Beijing. He has said that he doesn't believe or he doesn't blame the Hong Kong government for his arrest. He says that he believes it's Beijing that's behind the directive to round up these prominent pro-democracy activists. He also says that this is all part of the Communist Party trying to tighten its control on Hong Kong. Now, as far as reaction from the pro-Beijing camp here, that has been mostly muted. They've mostly just echoed what the Hong Kong government has said, mainly being that this is all being done in accordance to the law and this is not politically motivated. But I must mention quite an interesting development. Now, the Chinese state media has mentioned the arrest of all these prominent people on the microblogging site Weibo. The Chinese government doesn't usually like any kind of discussion on Hong Kong's democracy movements, or anyone to do with democracy in Hong Kong. But they seem to have allowed much chatter about this, and predictably, the kind of comments we're seeing are mainly from people who support the arrests, who are calling for greater restrictions on Hong Kong, and also are calling for greater support of Hong Kong's police.
The arrests follow remarkable comments by the Chinese government's two main agencies in the territory. The Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office denounced pro-democracy politicians for stalling proceedings in the Legislative Council. And Beijing's liaison office said it's not bound by a clause in the mini-constitution that bars direct interference in the city's affairs. After issuing contradictory statements, Hong Kong's government eventually supported mainland China's position. Let's introduce the panel, and in Hong Kong we have Martin Lee, the founding chairman of the Democratic Party of Hong Kong and a former legislative councillor and a barrister. In China's capital, Beijing, Andy Mok, senior research fellow at the Centre for China and Globalisation. And in Singapore, Victor Teo, assistant professor at the affiliated faculty with the China Studies programme at the University of Hong Kong. Welcome to you all. Martin Lee, first of all, why these arrests now? What's the timing significance? And why people like you, Jimmy Lai and Margaret Ng, the old school, if you like, of the democracy movement, not the younger activists that have been arrested previously?
Well, I'm sure they don't like us. Jimmy, myself, and another person, Albert Ho, another former chairman of my party, a former legislator. The three of us, together with Ensign Chen, the former chief secretary for Hong Kong, have been grouped together as the Gang of Four. And the three male members of the Gang of Four are now all charged together. But they left out Ensign Chen for the moment. So clearly, they are going to start very repressive tactics on Hong Kong. They want to control Hong Kong. as they actually threatened to do so a few years back, because in June 2014, the central government published a white paper in 7 different languages saying that the central government has comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong. Now compare that to Deng Xiaoping's one country, two systems in 1984, when we were told that it would be one country, two systems, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy, which means except foreign affairs and defense affairs, Hong Kong would have autonomy in everything else. Now today, Xi Jinping wants to implement his new policy on Hong Kong, still one country, two systems, but central government ruling Hong Kong with comprehensive jurisdiction. Now, this is a totally different concept from Deng Xiaoping's. Instead of leaving Hong Kong alone to run this place, they now want to control this place. So you can see everything now which is happening in Hong Kong goes in that direction, which is a departure from the blueprint set out for Hong Kong for 50 years. And this is the 23rd year, and Beijing already wants to exert full and comprehensive jurisdiction over us. That's the problem.
Andy Mock, do you see that? Is the central government taking off the gloves and is now prepared for a much more robust intervention in the governing of Hong Kong?
Well, I think clearly the Chinese central government is concerned about what's going on in Hong Kong, and certainly in the last year with whatever we want to call the unrest, that clearly it's a concern for the people of Hong Kong as it affects their lives, their livelihood, and their futures. And it's, of course, a concern for the central government in China as well. I would point out, too, that I think Martin makes a good point that there have been certainly changes. But I think it's important to recognize, too, we are 20 plus years in, and any legal framework, I think, needs to adapt to the times. So one important concept here is national security. And even a year or 2 years ago, we might not have thought of healthcare and public health issues as a national security issue. But today, I think the feeling is very different because the world changed. So on the one hand, I think to consider a rigid adherence to a strict interpretation at one point in time that never changes might not necessarily be the most realistic view. I think the framework of one country, two systems is very much in place and adhered to by China.
Victor, it wasn't supposed to be like this, was it? Wasn't Hong Kong supposed to be able to look after its own affairs for 50 years? Or are we seeing a remodeling of the one country, two systems idea?
Personally, I don't think it's a remodeling of the one country, two systems idea. I think it's an adjustment. So I tend to kind of agree with what Andy has just said. Hong Kong is, we're 22, 23 years into this new era. And I think local realities have changed. Mainland Chinese development have hastened. I think from Beijing's perspective, they are very worried about a couple of things. And one of the things is the perceived linking up of the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement with forces which they perceive to be hostile to China. So this is from the Beijing's perspective. And I think they are trying their best to not change the system, but at the same time to ensure that Chinese interests are looked after and that Hong Kong does not actually become a bastion of anti-Chinese activities in the near term or perhaps in the middle term. So this is one of the reasons why they are so keen to assert the sovereignty of China over Hong Kong. So in other words, what the Chinese are actually doing today is to remind the Hong Kong people that the one country comes before the two system. And it's not going to be a situation whereby Hong Kong is going to be another Taiwan, where they have de jure, de facto, if you like, independence. So particularly in September, because we are seeing the Legislative Council elections. And also, this is leading up to the U.S. elections. I think Beijing is very apprehensive of what might actually develop come this summer. So they are, I suppose, trying to assert or some sort of control over the situation in Hong Kong.
Martin Lee, do you get that idea as well? Is Beijing so worried about what it sees from the threat of the protests in Hong Kong, the existential threat of that it's worth cracking down on them, even at the risk of international condemnation?
Well, you've got to go back a few years. Had China honoured all her promises enshrined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, none of these problems, none of them would have happened. If China had allowed Hong Kong to develop democracy as promised, written into the Basic Law, which is that during the first 10 years of the handover, Hong Kong will develop democracy, but universal suffrage is the final goal, and that can be achieved in 10 years' time from the 1st of July 1997. Okay, that's the first promise. The second is that China will not interfere in Hong Kong's internal business. Now, if China had adhered to those promises, I can tell you, none of these disturbances would have happened in Hong Kong. Hong Kong people would be very happy with it. But China broke both of these major promises, and not only that, they now tell the whole world our basic policies regarding Hong Kong have now completely changed. So why aren't you guys worried about that? Why aren't you guys not speaking on that? Why should the international community leave Hong Kong alone? When they were lobbied for supporting the Joint Declaration on 26th of September 1984, when it was first announced to the world, I was surprised at the time. Why did the US government, Canadian government, Australian government, Japanese government, and so many governments in Europe actually loudly supported it? It was because China and Britain lobbied for international support very diligently, asking them to come out and support them openly and strongly, for fear that the emigration tide from Hong Kong would continue and many good people would then leave Hong Kong. So they asked for international support. Why shouldn't the international community now say to them, hey, what happened? You asked us to support your one country, two system per Deng Xiaoping, and we gave you that support. We continue to support one country, two systems, a la Deng Xiaoping. But why do you change it? Why don't you guys speak up? Why do you say, of course, they will do that now that they are stronger? But they committed themselves to 50 years, no change. And this is only the 23rd year. Why do you not focus on that?
Martin Lee, thank you. Andy Mock, that's a lot of it, isn't it? The central government has ignored the aspirations of the people of Hong Kong. They were promised they could elect their leader by universal suffrage. There are many excuses introduced, and it's never going to happen now. Beijing hasn't recognised what the people of Hong Kong want.
Well, I'm not sure I would completely agree with that. I think that, while Martin and people that share his views might certainly believe this, but I think that whatever China did in the past, we have to look at this in a broader context, meaning that it's not just a Hong Kong-China issue, and it's not just a regional issue, but we look at how the world has changed, and more and more, I think the U.S. has decided and declared China to be an adversary, and that the U.S. sees itself as locked in this, not just an economic competition, but an ideological and perhaps even an existential competition. And of course, this has just become formalized in 2017 with the White House National Security Strategy. But this theme or this current, I think, has been present for a number of years. And when we look at it from that broader geopolitical context, I think clearly countries like the United States, or I should say the U.S. in particular, I think has been very active in looking for ways to foment unrest and challenges for China all around the world. So I'm not so sure that certainly, I would say Martin is in the more reasonable camp of being dissatisfied with the situation. But Hong Kong is a very diverse place. There are people with more extreme views. I think people more easily incited or perhaps provoked. So I think that whatever China would have done in the past did either sins of alleged sins of commission or omission. Still, I think there would be a minority of discontents in Hong Kong looking to stir up trouble.
Victor, the Basic Law was adopted by the National People's Congress 30 years ago now. The world is very different. It's a more polarised world politically, whether it's Trump's America, Brexit Britain, Viktor Orban's Hungary. So is it harder for the ideals of a one country, two systems system to survive in this totally different world?
I don't think so. I think I've lived in Hong Kong for about 12 years now. And before that, I was living in the UK for almost a decade. And I can tell you that I feel, for the most part, very free in Hong Kong. I think the real problem is the question of power sharing with the Democrats. And this is what I think the Democratic camp is so angry about. For most part, Hong Kong people are pretty much free to do what they want. In fact, I think they have a lot more freedoms than their compatriots on mainland. And therein lies the problem. Beijing has a political problem because on one hand, it's trying to maintain the one country, two system in Hong Kong and let the Hong Kong system run itself. And on the other hand, it's trying to control things on the mainland. But everybody, whether in mainland or in Hong Kong, are Chinese citizens. So this disparity is becoming is presenting problems for governance in China. To a large extent, the freedom that has been accorded to Hong Kong people has enabled them to go onto the streets to protest every year. And of course, it's not just the world that is watching, it's also the people in mainland China that are watching. So you can understand how this might actually cause some concerns in China regarding the repercussions, or if you like, the follow-on effects for political governance in mainland China itself. Right now, Hong Kong is still very valuable to mainland China, perhaps not as valuable as it once was 20, 25, 30 years ago. But nonetheless, Hong Kong is still a very, very valuable part of China. So I believe that the mainland authorities are very keen to preserve what the system that have built up in Hong Kong as the way forward. What I think the mainland authorities are frustrated with is the perceived political bickering that has been going on between the different camps. And I think they are not really sure what might be the way forward. They are also not sure as to how, perhaps given more freedom in Hong Kong, how the future might actually play out. What they actually are really concerned about is the propensity of perhaps the Democratic camp to declare or edge towards independence. I think this is the real concern behind all these things that are being done in Hong Kong.
Martin Lee, you were involved certainly in the early stages of the drafting of that basic law. Did you foresee these challenges then, and can the basic law withstand the pressure that it seems to be under now?
Well, I said at the time openly that one country, two systems can work, but very difficult. But there were two sure conditions, so vital conditions. One is Hong Kong must have democracy, genuine democracy, so that our chief executive, as well as all members of the legislature, would be elected by the people. So they will find it a necessity for their own sake to defend Hong Kong system, whenever there is any conflict of interest between mainland and Hong Kong. Otherwise, they lose the next elections. That's the first thing. The second thing is Beijing must not interfere with our internal affairs. Both of these are written into the basic law. So I thought it could work. But if Beijing had actually allowed that to develop, supposing there's already democracy, then the Democrats would have the majority in the Legislative Council, and we would run Hong Kong as confined in the basic law. I have never suggested that we should be independent. In fact, I openly said it is not permitted by the basic law. The first paragraph says that Hong Kong is an inalienable part of China. So independence is out. But one country, two systems, please. And the one country was already there on the 1st of July, 1997, when the British flag came down and the Chinese flag Why not? That's one country. But the two systems, they should be kept apart. That was a promise. Okay? Neither British nor the Chinese should run Hong Kong for 50 years from the 1st of July. Hong Kong people should run it with a high degree of autonomy. All right? Give us democracy and don't interfere, and Hong Kong will be a fine place. But no, they won't. So don't, please don't just defend China. Look at Hong Kong. We were not asking for anything more than what was already promised and written into China's own basic law for Hong Kong. I am not asking for anything else. I've always said no independence for Hong Kong, but give us one country, two systems, as promised. Nothing more, certainly nothing less.
Okay. Andy, one of the puzzling things is that the central government in Beijing, it was understood, wanted to use one country, two system to show Taiwan how it could work. And Taiwan, the people of Taiwan must be looking at what's happening in Hong Kong now and saying, look, we told you it can never work. There's no democracy there now in Hong Kong. So is the central government bothered about what China sees happening in Hong Kong, what Taiwan sees as happening in Hong Kong?
Well, I think certainly at one point in time, that was, I think, certainly one approach to the reunification of China, so Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau. But I think also that the central government is, I think, savvy enough to recognize that there ought to be different ways to accomplish a goal, especially an important goal. So again, we look at, this was, of course, the thinking or the hope when in 1997 that success using this model with Hong Kong would then directly lead to Taiwan also resolving the Taiwan question as well. Now, clearly, we're 20 years in, the world has changed, Hong Kong has changed, China has changed, and of course, Taiwan has changed as well. So whether or not this approach still works, of course, there are voices in Taiwan that are very much against any form of change, becoming closer with China. But on the other hand, has this completely ruled out the possibility of a similar type of framework working? I'm not sure. Again, I think it remains to be seen. But I think one thing that has not changed is the absolute commitment on the part of the Chinese government to resolve the Taiwan question.
And Victor, to you as well, what's happening in Hong Kong must make people in Taiwan, must make the likelihood of any sort of strengthening of ties between China and Hong Kong, China and Taiwan, even more remote than they were before.
Well, I think so, unless the tone of the politics in Taiwan changes. But I think it's going to be unlikely unless the Kuomintang manages to get some really attractive candidates. Having said that, I think in Hong Kong it's still possible for the one system, one country, two system to function really well. And I think the ball is in both the Democratic parties, the movements camp court right now. In the upcoming elections, if the Democratic Party can exhibit some sort of concern for Beijing's national security agenda, and if the Democratic Party can de-link Hong Kong's democratization from the national security concerns, meaning they can say that they want political accountability, they want to have universal suffrage, but if they do not make such strong linkages with the United States, particularly U.S. Congress, particularly getting members of UK and US political establishment to attack China or make anti-communist, anti-Chinese statements, I think, and exhibit a reasonable amount of political willingness to work with the pro-establishment camp, I think the politics in Hong Kong can take a very positive tone. If only both camps do not make their politics so, if you like, Radical?
Okay.
I'm
All
not
right.
sure if that is the correct word.
Okay, all right. Unfortunately, gentlemen, we are out of time. I'm very sorry, Martin Lee. I have to say thanks to all of our guests, to Martin Lee, to Andy Mock, and to Victor Teo, and to thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com, and for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.